Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see all the bright and shiny faces out there. Some old friends. All right. I don't really have any announcements. Nick kind of covered everything, so I'll just jump right into it. It's amazing, just to add to the Bible study and add to my sermon a little bit today. I wasn't planning on starting out with this, but I think it just occurred to me as we was talking about this. Do you know, Trump went over to the European countries and the G7 summit. You know that there's two nations in that summit that have not had any terrorist attacks? None whatsoever. Japan's one, Poland's the other one. You know the reason why? They don't let refugees in.
That's right. Gee, isn't that a miracle?
Isn't that something? Yeah. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, they're trying to pressure them into taking it. Yeah. Well, and that's what we've seen this last week is, all kinds, another attack on innocent children and Christians and committed by those cowards that hide behind women and children, to do their cowardly acts, and that's what they do, and it's beyond our ability as human beings to imagine someone that could be so bent on an ideology that they would commit such an act as like we've seen this last week. But this isn't the only one. We can go back and we can just count them one right after another, whether it's in Europe or our nation or whatever, where this kind of stuff happens. It happens almost now on a weekly or daily basis. Yeah, it's just incredible. I heard the statistics the other day that 90% of the terror attacks are actually happening in Muslim nations. We just don't hear all the attacks that go on almost a daily basis. What we hear is the 10% that happens in the Western nations or the European nations. And of course, a lot of the attacks are on Coptic Christians that are in the Middle East and stuff, as we've seen this last week, where 23 of them were killed in a brutal and mindless way. They were going to worship somewhere in a temple, and they were on a bus, and they were just slaughtered like just so many cattle. It's just incredible. And but there is today a great push on all the nations around the world to do something about this, and Islamic terrorists, because it's really kind of getting out of hand. And Trump over the last week has brought this issue to the forefront. If he hadn't done anything else, he at least did that. And I think the world owes him a great debt of gratitude over that, because it's become a global problem, and it's not just a Western one. It's a global problem, and like the statistics said, it's a Middle Eastern problem too, and they need to deal with it.
Well, now they've got the deal in the Philippines.
Yeah, well, it's happening everywhere. In my mind, one day in the near future, hopefully, because of Daniel, we read in Daniel chapter 11, that this is going to come to a screeching halt. And it's simply because what I started out with, because of what we see in Poland and what we see in Japan. They are a blaring example as to why Islam refugees or Muslim refugees are such an issue. Because in Daniel 11 there's a reference to the king of the north and the king of the south. And to me, this represents ideologies. It always has. To me, the king of the north is a Christian world, and the king of the south is the Islamic world. And I've said that since 2000, that these were not actual kings, these are nations. And that the ideology rules the nations. Even the kings and the princes and everything else that are actual physical rulers over those nations are bowed before their ideologies. And I've been kind of made fun of and sneered at of my ideal, and my ideal has been dismissed a little bit, that these are ideologies and not a 10-nation combine or an actual nation of people coming up from the South or whatever. But I don't know what else they could be, because when you look at it, we see today exactly what's happening. Islam is pushing at the nations, at the Christian and Western nations. They're pushing their ideology, they're pushing their lifestyle, they're pushing their laws, they're pushing everything that they can in wherever they go into these other European nations and so forth. And I believe one day there's going to be a great pushback, as it says in Daniel 11, where they will be pushed back into their prospective lands or their prospective places, because if they don't assimilate, then they will have to go to a place to where they can worship and live under their own laws and things that they want to do. And they can't do it in the Western nations, they'll do it where they came from. And history shows us that whenever there is a battle between these two nations, and it always has been going on, and please don't work under the assumption, as we were talking about in the Bible study as well, that Islam began in 600 AD. All Islam did was co-opt the religion of the moon god.
Right.
Sin, the religion of sin is what it's called. Because Mecca was there long before Islam ever started. And they worshipped in the same way the moon god Sin as they do in Islam today under Muhammad, their god, Muhammad, or prophet, or whatever he is. It's just a religion that is co-opted. And same thing with Christianity. Christianity didn't begin 300 years ago. It just co-opted the pagan religions that were around it. Mithra. That's all those two religions ever did. They just co-opted other religions. Because you can take the accoutrements of Christianity, as we've done so many times in this church, and we can look back and see where they started thousands of years before Constantine ever put them into play as so-called Christianity. But whenever we look at Christianity and we see Islam going at each other, the people that are caught in the middle is the Israelites, the Jewish nation. They're always caught in the middle. Anytime Islam comes into power or into play, they attack the Jewish people, or Israel, whatever you want to call them. And anytime Christianity ever needed a scapegoat, they used the Jews. Either one. The Jewish people have been caught in the middle. When you look at Christianity, we can firmly put our fingers upon the Inquisitions and the plagues, and even Hitler used them as a scapegoat. The Jews got blamed. They got blamed for everything. Oh, it's Jews' fault, we're going to go do this. Jews' fault, so we'll kill 500,000 people, or 6 million, or 60 million, or whatever. And there are groups of people out there that says that the Jews were not killed in any kind of numbers that the world has ample evidence that they were in the Second World War. They say there was a matter of only maybe 60,000 or so that were actually killed in concentration camps. Well, if 6 got killed in concentration camps that way, that's way too many. And we can see today that the Syrians are doing much the same thing in their prison camps. They've got satellite photographs of crematoriums and stuff. So it's something that just continues to go on. But we come down to end time, our time, and we see the ideology of hating Christians and attacking and killing them for no reasons. And once more, the Jewish nation finds itself in the middle by all these other nations around it. And a lot of people want to lay the blame at their doorstep, but it's not their fault. With all the terrorist attacks by the militant Islam, patience is wearing thin, and nations are turning around. They're changing their minds and the views about what's going on over there. And they're turning their mind and their views about refugees coming. There's a lot of pushback these days in a lot of those nations about taking more refugees, especially in our nation here. Because it's a culture that refuses to assimilate into these other nations. When they move in, they won't assimilate into the culture. They want their own laws. They want their own religion. They group together in their own little communities instead of assimilating into the neighborhoods. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, it says, Daniel chapter 11, verse 40, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the north, or the king of the south, push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and they shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." Now, as I said earlier, the Islamic nations, or this militant side of it, especially maybe you can even, I know Iran is Persians, and they're not. I forgot what Arab nation, but they still are part of that country and part of that culture over there, and they are pushing. Some of them are pushing very hard at the United Nations, especially in the form of terrorism. And I could tell you today, I could tell you right now how to make terrorist attacks stop. I could stop them tomorrow if they would let me. But I'm not going to tell you how, because I don't want to look like a bloodthirsty heathen or something up here. But there is a way to do it. And but we're led by the PC people, or the PC police of the world today, and they don't mind making us the targets of their insane ideas. And so my idea wouldn't go over very well as how to make it stop. But I could stop it. I guarantee I could. I'll tell you all afterwards. You on the internet, you're not going to get to hear. But in verse 41 it says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of the hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon." Now, nations like Jordan, Turkey, and those around, that's who they're referring to here. They are allies of the Americans, or the U.S., and they will. It says that they are going to escape, and they have allied with them, and that is a fact. Or allied with us, and that's a fact. They're not categorized as we see the Islamic nations or terrorist nations today. And you do realize where most of the terrorists, what nation most of the terrorists have come from. Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, it's a big problem. So we have to work with them to deal with it. Now, we've been warring with this ideology for the last couple of decades, but there will be like it says in Daniel chapter 11, a big push that will push them back, and that will be one of the signs of the times of the end. And those crazy fanatics, who knows what's going to happen? I can't tell you blow for blow or step for step what's going to happen. I can only read Scripture and look at it and give you an idea as to what's going to happen. But here's yet another prophesied circumstance, and it's a stage that has been set, and it's been set for our lifetime, for us to see, for us to discern. In conjunction with chapter 11 of Daniel, we are reaping the seeds that we ourselves have sown, and because we are bending to the will of this immoral people and their nationalistic ideals. Now, we've seen many nations and kingdoms rise and fall over time. We can go back in our history books and we can study them, we can look at them, and we can see what caused them to fall and why they fell, and why they're no longer nations in the world today. And there's a commonality with just about all of them. And it's a series of events that precede their fall, and almost always they're the same signs. And I call them road signs, and they got laughed at me when they asked me what my sermon name was today. I said it's road signs, and it's basically what it is. And you know, if you've ever been a truck driver or anything, they tell you one thing: you got to read every sign as you're going down the road. And I always thought to myself, well, that's stupid. How can you read every sign going? You can't read every sign, but you read as many as you possibly can to figure out where you're going, how long it's going to take you to get there, and which way you got to go. And so nearly all of these signs are direct results of our refusal to obey God as a nation and as a people. And they are linked to the blind eye we as a people have towards God and His way. And I hate to use the word religion, but His way of life. And that's what it's called in the Bible, His way. Now, there are 7 signs, or 7 road signs, or events foretelling of a nation's collapsing. And we can go through these one at a time, and we will. And I did this slightly in a different way a few weeks back in a Bible study, and I kind of got to hurry because this does take a little time, and I had to cut some of it down a little bit. But as I said then, and I'll say now in preface to these signs, this works on many levels, as a nation, as a state, as a church, as a home, or as an individual. So, but they're all linked in one way. They're linked to a nation bringing in foreign gods, or a nation worshiping foreign gods. And first off is the accumulation of debt. That's the first one we go to. Our debt is sitting at a staggering $20 trillion. And I forgot what the statistics was on how big $1 trillion was or whatever. You could stack what dollar bills and it'd go almost all the way to the moon or something like that. It's amazing how much $1 trillion is. But it's much more than that if you add up all this nation has in unfunded liabilities and things like that. It's probably more up like 100 trillion or something to that effect. But the debt is largely due to the 20 trillion is largely due to our fight that we've had with Islam over the last 30 years, so to speak, especially the last 20 years since 9/11, because I think we were actually at a even keel there before 9/11, or right about it. I mean, we didn't know anything. We didn't, so it wasn't that much. But if we did, maybe 500 billion or something like that, which is, just a drop in the bucket compared to what today's finances are. But but when we started fighting, and we had to fight back these people and stuff like that, then the national debt started growing. Of course, I believe there was a lot of monkey play in the reason why we've got $20 trillion in debt. I don't think it had to be that much by any stretch of the imagination. But that's political, and I'll try to stay out of that as much as I possibly can. But it's made us a borrowing nation, not a lender nation. And if we obeyed the words of God, as it says in Deuteronomy 28, if you want to turn to Deuteronomy 28, verses 8 through 13. If we obeyed Scripture, if we look at Scripture, if we obeyed God, it says, the Eternal will command the blessings on you and your storehouses and all in which you set your hand, and He will bless you in the land which the Eternal your God has given you. The Eternal will establish you as a holy people to Himself, just as He has sworn to you. If you keep the commandments of the Eternal your God and walk in His ways, then all the people shall see that you are called by the name of the Eternal, and they shall be afraid of you. And the Eternal will grant you plenty of goods in the fruit of your body, and in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of your ground, and the land which Eternal swore to your fathers to give you. And the Eternal will open to you His good treasure of the heavens to give you rain in the land of its season, and to bless all the work of your hand. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. And the Eternal will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not beneath. If you heed the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and are careful to observe them, you shall not turn aside from any of the words which I command you this day, to the right or to the left, to go after other gods to serve them. Now, you can't have love within you of God if you're serving other gods, if you're allowing other gods to dictate your policies in your land and in your countries. If you put yourself under their rule, and let's use Sharia law. If we allow Sharia law to dictate to us how we're going to rule the people of this country, then there's little love for God, the real God. Ever wonder why these other nations and these other countries have third world conditions in them? You ever wonder that? They've got just as good a land. They've got just as good of abilities and educated people and everything else, yet they live in squalor. God does not rule their lands. God is not their God, not the real God, is not their God. So they suffer. They suffer. Because they reject God and His ways, including borrowing money. And how they deal with money and how they look at money. Who's got all the money in all these third world countries? The leaders. The everyday person doesn't, because they don't allow it. Matthew 6:24, he says, Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. No one can serve two masters. And what's the reason why we are in such debt? Greed. It's a simple word, greed. We are told to owe no one as a people, as a person. And we shouldn't owe anyone as a nation. In Romans 13:8, he says, owe no one anything except the love for one another. For he who loves one another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does not harm a neighbor, therefore love is fulfillment of the law. And what he's saying is, the last 6 laws of the commandments are how we deal with our neighbors and how we deal with one another. And whenever it comes to money, we ought to deal with each other in that fashion. That doesn't mean that we need to give everybody everything. We need to teach people how. What's the old adage? You know, give a person a fish, they eat for a day. Teach them how to fish, and they'll feed themselves forever. Kind of, sort of. I may have said that in a bad way, but living under God and His holy rules teaches us how to live and how to deal with our finances. And laws are a guidebook to loving and peace as a nation. Alright, the second one is a continuance of war. Continuance of war. It's a promise for God for not obeying Him. James chapter 4, he asks, James chapter 4, verse 1, or I think it's verse 4. He says, where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires and pleasure that war in your members? You lust, you do not have. You murder and you covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that the friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the Scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? but He gives more grace. Therefore, He says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. You know, it's amazing when we look at this. Where do wars come from? Why are we in wars? Because we don't deal with them in a godly way. Why do we keep having terrorist attacks? Because we don't deal with them in a godly way. The way God tells us to deal with the other nations in that respect. Now we can see an example of this where there was a continuance of war because of disobedience of God in 2 Chronicles chapter 16. And this is where King Asa didn't obey God, but instead sought out advice from other nations and their gods, just as we do today. Do we go to God to figure out how to do it? No, we don't. People would laugh at you and think you're stupid and an imbecile if you said, well, why don't we look at the Scriptures and see how to deal with these guys? You know, it's all a show. In 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 7 through 9, he says, At that time Hananiah the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said to him, Because you have relied on the king of Syria and have not relied on the eternal your God, therefore the army of the king of Syria has escaped from your hand. Were the Ethiopians and the Luban not a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen, yet because you relied on the Eternal, He delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Eternal run to and fro throughout the whole earth, and show Himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to Him. In this you have done foolishly. Therefore from now on you shall have wars. You're going to have war. You're constant, because you didn't do what God said. Now you got this problem all around you, and you're going to have wars. It seems this has been our judgment as well as a nation today, because we tend to bow to every religion and every national wish from every other country, except what God commands. Somebody was talking about this morning about us taking prayer out of schools. There's schools somewhere where they won't let people pray, or the students pray in the school, but now they've turned around and want to put a prayer room or something like that in there for Islamic students. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And except for what, when it comes to God, why is God the only thing that's not allowed in schools? The real God. Why is He the only thing? Everything else is in there. You can have transgender bathrooms, you can have Islam, you can have Hinduism, you can have all this other stuff, but you can't have God. Why? Well, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 47, he says this. You want to be stupid? Okay. What's that old Forrest Gump thing is? Stupid is as stupid does. Well, the Eternal will cause you, verse 25, Deuteronomy 28, I thought that was 47. Sometimes these little numbers get added in here, and I'm not sure which one's which. I think it's verse 25, starting in verse 25. I didn't change it. The Eternal will cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You shall go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them. You shall become troublesome to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your carcasses shall be food for all the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and no one shall frighten them away. The Eternal will strike you with boils of Egypt, with tumors, and with the scab, with the itch, from which you cannot be healed. Does AIDS come to mind? I mean, the Eternal will strike you with madness and blindness and confusion of the heart. Is there a political party that comes to mind? And you shall grope at noonday as a blind man gropes in the darkness, and you shall not prosper in your ways, or you shall not only oppress and plunder and continually, and no one shall save you. Oh man, I tell you, it looks bad, doesn't it? I don't think we've seen the very beginnings of what's going to happen to this nation. God doesn't promise less of this. He promises more of it. Especially at the end time, we can see where He says there'll be wars and rumors of wars. And in Matthew 24, verse 3, verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of war. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places, and all these are the beginning of sorrows. Boy, I tell you, more, not less. So there's going to be a hard road ahead in days ahead, I believe. And number 3, we become a divided population. In 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 12 through 19, he says this. And remember this story. Remember this when Solomon died, and here he has 2 sons. And Rehoboam is the son that's supposed to become king over all Israel. So Rehoboam decides to do something. He listens to these hardcore people around him when he shouldn't. But let's read it. 2 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 12. So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam on the 3rd day. Jeroboam's his brother. The king had dictated, saying, come back to me on the 3rd day. Then the king answered them roughly. King Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elder, and he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to it. My father chastened you with whips, but I will chasten you with scourges. So the king did not listen to the people, for the turn of events was from God, and the Eternal might fulfill his work, which he had spoken to the hand of Ahijah the Shilonite, to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, what share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house of David. And so all Israel departed to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the children of Israel who dwelt in the city of Judah. Then King Rehoboam and Hadoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but the children of Israel stoned him with stones, and he died. And therefore King Rehoboam mounted in chariot in haste and fled to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. So what happened is there was a split in the nation. 10 tribes became a nation under Jeroboam and Israel to the north, and then you have the 3 tribes under Rehoboam in Judea, which was Benjamin, Levite, and Jacob, and they became 2 nations separate. And they actually at one time went to war against one another. And of course we know the story about the 10 tribes being taken captive by the Assyrians, and then later on the house of Judah was taken captive by Babylon, which they were returned, but Israel wasn't. But anyway, there was a split in the nation because of chaos in the leadership of the nation, within what one felt was right and the other one felt was wrong. And we see that today in our nation. There's a divided population in our nation on how to deal with so many issues. We call them different things today. We call them liberals, and we call them conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans, and different things of that nature. But I'm afraid, as we've seen over the last year, that the animosity toward one another is becoming so great. Who knows how this is going to deal with the nation in the coming days and future ahead? Will we become like Israel? Will we become a split nation because we can't live with each other easily? There's several people who are calling for a convention, a constitutional convention, to change some things. And you may be for it, you may be against it. I don't know. But I'm just saying that if we can't live in a land of tolerance, if we can, and the problem is when we get rid of God out of our government, and we get rid of God out of our schools, and we get rid of God out of everything, where we can't even have Him on a courthouse lawn, His words shown to the other people, then there's a void. And that void is going to be filled with hate and animosity and all these other things that are just not godly. And so eventually we become a divided nation. And people were divided long before we ever became a nation. Jesus promised that He was going to divide them because of belief. And believe me, it's belief that drives this. You may not think it whenever you hear all these things, but that's what it is, because in the basis of most people's minds, they think that they're religious. 80% of the people in this country believe that they believe in God, is what they say, in one form or another. But some believes it one way, another believe another way, and it's because we have not been taught correctly, and we've allowed these pagan traditions to infiltrate into our religion and our schools and our thoughts, that we can't understand fully what the real will of God is. In John chapter 7 verse 43 it says, John chapter 7 verse 43, he said, "Therefore many from the crowd, when they heard the saying, said, Truly this is a prophet. Others said, This is Christ. But some said, Will the Christ come out of Galilee?" Oh, now they made it personal. You know, now they're just attacking His ethnicity. "Has not the Scripture said that Christ comes from the seed of David and from the town of Bethlehem, where David was?" So there was a division among the people because of Him. Now some of them wanted to take Him, but no one laid hands on Him. And it's said today, if Christ returned today, the Christian churches in our world today would stone Him. They would throw Him out of their churches and stuff, because what's He going to teach? He's going to teach the Sabbath, the holy days, clean and unclean foods, and all this stuff. They said, oh, all that's done away with. Jesus' own words tells us this is the way it should be. And He also tells us that He's going to pit father against son. If you read in Matthew chapter 10, verse 35, it says, "Do not think that I come to bring peace on the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." And what do people say? Oh, He's compassionate, and He wants us to feed all these homeless people and all these other things, and we're always being told that this is the kind of person He was. But He says, but His own word says, "I bring a sword. I'm going to bring a sword, and I'm going to put father against father, brother against brother, mother against daughter, and so on." And He says, and He goes on to say in verse 37 of Matthew 10, He says, "He who loves his father and mother more than me is not worthy of me." Does that sound like the Christ that the people portray in the world today? "And he who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." Wow, we've got a really contorted view of who Christ is. And see, that plays right in to the downfall of our nation, because we've distorted our view of our God. The one that's on our money, the one that's on our above the Supreme Court building, the Continental Congress building, all that, the Liberty Bell, you name it. God is there everywhere. And we've distorted that view especially over the last 50 years. Number 4, the death of excellence. The death of excellence. Isaiah chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Let's start there. Isaiah chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. I got to hook them. And he says, "For behold, the Eternal of hosts, takes away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stock and the store, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water. the mighty man, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, the diviner, the elder, the captain of 50, and the honorable man, the counselor and the skillful artisan, the expert, enchanter. I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. And the people will be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his own neighbor. And the child will be insolent toward the elder, and the base toward the honorable. Here we go again. Here we go again. We can relate this right back to bringing in foreigners from other countries. We truly can, because we've let their ideology of how to deal with children infiltrate our cultures and our traditions. And now what do we have? We have children who are up in their 30s and mid-30s who are still living in their parents' houses. And I'm not talking about a small percentage. I'm talking about like 30% of the millennials, they say, in this nation are still living in their parents' houses. Now, let me give you a little bit of a qualifier here. I did live with my parents when I was in my early 20s for about 6 months when I was in between homes. But I got out as quick as I could. So, if anybody ever says, well, you did too, I did. But I'm talking about they rely, and let me put another qualifier. When I did live with my parents, I had to pay rent. I had to do chores. They didn't just let me live there. I was an adult, and I had to make my own living. So, but that's not the way it is with children nowadays. And they run their parents' household. We were watching something the other day on the TV, and I just couldn't believe how these children were acting toward their parents. I just thought, man, if I did that when I was a kid, I wouldn't be here today. So it says they're insolent toward their elders, and they are. Look at what happens in the streets in St. Louis and all these, Washington, D.C., and all these other places. They don't care. They want you to give what you have earned all your life to make. They want you to give it to them. You owe it to them. That's what they think. We're not that nation. Why do we put up with this silliness? I'd stop and I have to just stop myself from destroying my TV at night. Why do we put up with this silliness? Why is our government kowtowing to these people? And I find myself with no answers. We failed our children by not teaching them the commandments of God. We have failed to teach them how to dream big. And not in a vile way, but in a godly way. We failed to teach them how to live a godly life. Instead, they think it's great to have Sharia law. Before you think that is such a good thing, you really ought to do a study in it. Especially women. In 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, this is a quality we should strive for, and we should strive to put in our young children. He says, verse 5 of 2 Peter chapter 1, but also for this very reason, given diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. For if these things are yours in abundance, you will neither bear nor unfruitful knowledge of the eternal Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these things is short-sighted even to blindness, and forgotten what he was cleansed from in his old sin. My life didn't really have any meaning, so to speak. I was just trudging along like everybody else, young person, before I came into the church. But when I came into church, I discovered that there was much more to my life than just having a good time. And one thing led to another. And I went back to school and I learned how to do things right. And I did it with God in my mind and as a background to my life. And good things happened to me. I was blessed by God. But it wasn't until I took that step that I realized that I was not striving for excellence. I was just striving to make do, however I could. It begins with our customs and our laws. It begins with our traditions. It begins with God. Because, you know, He tells us in Leviticus 20, verse 23, He says, You shall therefore keep all my statutes, all my judgments, and perform them, that the land where I'm bringing you to dwell may not vomit you out. And that's what's happening to a large part of a segment of our society today. Because this is God's land. And you shall not walk in the statutes of nations which I'm casting out before you, for they commit all these things, and therefore I abhor you. But I have said to you, you shall not inherit their land, and I will give it to you. You shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I, the eternal your God, has separated you from all the peoples. Well, we better act like we've been separated. Better begin acting that way. And I'm talking about us as a nation. For any of those that are listening to me on the internet. Number 6. Sin on parade. Are we at 5? I thought we did 5. Yeah, last one was 5. This is number 6. Sin on parade. It begins with the denial of God. Psalms 10:4 says, There is no God. It goes on to say, For the wicked boast of his heart's desire. He blesses the greedy and renounces the eternal. The wicked and proud conceit does not seek God. God is in none of his thoughts. They believe all those around them and think that they believe all the people around them, especially the young generation, that they think that they're oblivious to God's way of life and God's scrutiny of their ways. They don't care. Even if they did think that God exists, they don't care. Isaiah chapter 47, verse 10. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 10. They don't think that their ways are being seen. They don't think that there's any repercussions for what they do. They don't think, or believe, I should say, that they have to do what God commands. In verse 10 of Isaiah 47, and they probably don't in this physical world, but whenever they're resurrected, they're going to learn a different story. He says, For you have trusted in your wickedness. You have said, No one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you. How do I say more? But he goes on to say, he says, You have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me. Therefore evil shall come upon you. You shall not know from where it arises, and trouble shall fall upon you. You will not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon you suddenly, which you shall not know. So these things are going to happen to you. I keep hearkening back to the things that have happened in our nation in the last 30 years, and we see the pride and the arrogance of people in our nation today, and then the sicknesses and diseases and just the chaos that has happened in our nation because of it. And they don't want to believe God. They don't want to even believe He's real. And I'll put part of that blame in our educational institutions. Even in the face of God, they are arrogant and proud. Even if in His face. Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9. He says, For Jerusalem stumbled and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Eternal, to provoke the eyes of His glory. The look upon their countenance continents witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom, and they do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. And there was a time in the city of Judah when they were as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. There's a time, there's this nation today is as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. And you say, well, how could that be? We've got God in this nation. You can still go to church. You can still worship. Have you seen this latest video where the people of Planned Parenthood are talking about baby parts?
I didn't see it, but I heard about it.
How can some Christians, people who call themselves Christians, advocate such a heinous and brutal and terrible and sad? It's worse than terrorism. And I won't get into what they said. It's just sickening. It's sickening. And then you have the alternative lifestyles trying to push their way upon the land and make it law that we accept what and who they are. That we have to reject the Bible over them and their lifestyle. I can't do that. If they tell me I can't do that or I'll go to jail, I'm going to jail. Because I can't do it. I will not marry one of them. I will not take a photo of a gay marriage. I will not make a cake for them. I'm sorry, I just won't do it. I don't believe in it. I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong for our government to try to push it off on us. And that leads us to number 7, the rejection of truth. 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 3 said there's going to come a day. If we start 2 Timothy chapter 4 verse 3, he says, we'll start in verse 1. It says, I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at His appearing in His kingdom. Preach the word, be ready in season, out of season, convince, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears. They will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth, and turn aside to fables. But you be watchful in all things, endure affliction, to do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. He said there's a time that's going to come. He said, and we're here. We're here. People would rather hear fables about God. They would rather put together some Disney cartoon about who they think God is than rather open the Scriptures and say, this is what He says. This is the Word of the Eternal. This is what He wants us to do. Some of the shows they put out in the last few years about God's people, like Noah and some of the other things, is just blasphemous. And about Christ, I quit watching shows they bring out about Christ because they're literally blasphemous. I don't want nothing to do with them. I don't want them in my mind, in my eye. I don't want any kind of influence from them. They're just bad. In Isaiah chapter 30 verse 10, he said that this is the attitude of people today. This is what they want. He says, now go and write before them on a tablet and note it on a scroll, that it may be for a time to come forever and ever, that this rebellious people, lying children who will not hear the law of the Eternal, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things, but speak to us smooth things. Prophesy deceits. Get out of the way, turn aside from the path, cause the Holy One of Israel to cease from before us. Does the Old Testament's done away sound familiar? The laws don't matter anymore. We don't have to eat or obey the Levitical food laws. We can eat pork, catfish, all those kind of things we want. Does all those things sound familiar in light of these Scriptures? They should, because this is the attitude. They seek out ministers and preachers who will tell them, oh, it's okay. It's all right. It's a good thing. But will not say, well, what does your Scripture say? I don't know how many people have come up and told me over the years and said, you know, I went and asked my preacher, Sunday preacher, about the Sabbath, and he says, you know, that's right what you say, the Sabbath is the seventh day, but I can't preach that. I've heard that so many times that I can't even count. They know. Jesus said this in John 14:6. John 14:6. Jesus said to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Your Sunday preacher will not get you in the kingdom. The Pope will not get you in the kingdom. Some guy in funny robes and backward collar will not get you in the kingdom. It is through Christ alone. It's through His words alone. That's the 7 things that happens to a nation before they fall. That is the commonality with all the nations that fall from grace. That is our heritage if we continue down the road without God. Why is this important? It's important to all of us. It should be. I believe we're at the end time. And it's important that we see it because a lot of prophecy in my mind is being fulfilled and is on the verge of being fulfilled. The way things are lining up in the world today, I could see it happening. I can see the nations lining up to fit Daniel, to fit Matthew 24, and to fit Revelations. I can see those things coming to play. All this spells a death knell for our nation if we don't sit up and take notice. It's time we quit putting God on a back burner. It's time we make Him forefront in our lives. On May 14th of next year, Israel will have been an independent nation for 70 years. Why is that important? Daniel 9:24. Daniel 9 verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgressions, to make an end to sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring an everlasting righteousness, to seal up visions and prophecy, to anoint the most holy. 70 weeks, 70 years. Weeks are often translated as years in Scripture. To seal up the vision and prophecy. Is that the beginning? I don't know. I can't stand up here, and I won't stand up here and tell you I know how things are going to happen and when it's going to happen. I'm not going to give you dates. I'm not going to do any of those things. But I'm going to point out scriptures like this, and whenever they match historical references around us, I'll give them to you. And this is one. And I think we need to take heed of this. I think we need to take a long, hard look at this. This is a road sign. This is a big road sign. And these other things that are happening in our nation today, they're road signs. And they're things that ought to be getting our attention. As a nation, as a people, and as God's people. Because I can say almost for a fact that the age of Elohim is about to explode upon this world. And one fact remains glaring before all the people of the world, and they know it for a fact because they preach it too. Christ is returning one day. The question is, are we going to be ready? Are we going to see those signs? Are we going to pay attention to them as a people, as God's people? We better.